Hello, everyone. Welcome to the third talk of this session. We have Anurag telling us about block rewards, non-transaction fees keep miners faithful in blockchain protocols. Go ahead.
Thank you for the introduction. Uh, Good evening, everyone. I am Anurag Jain, an undergraduate researcher under Professor Sujit Gujar at the Machine Learning Lab at the International Institute of Information Technology, Hyderabad. Today, I am going to present a work on blockchain mining games in the paper titled Block Rewards, Not Transaction Fees Keep Miners Faithful in Blockchain Protocols. So in this paper, we discuss if the manner in which the miners are rewarded for successfully mining a block in a blockchain protocol influences the strategy choice of the miners. And we find that yes, indeed, it does matter in how are we rewarding the miners. First, let's take a look at Bitcoin and the issues that surround it. So Bitcoin is a cryptocurrency invented anonymously under the pseudonym of Satoshi Nakamoto. In his white paper in 2008, he described a blockchain protocol in which the miners compete to mine a block, and the winner is rewarded either by a fixed block reward or by transaction fees contributed by the users of the cryptocurrency. So there are two principal ways of rewarding the miners: block rewards and transaction fees. Block rewards is the reward miners can assign to themselves for mining a block. This reward means new currency, which adds to the total amount of currency in circulation. This reward can be fixed by protocol designers, which allows them to pick a suitable value which could offset the mining costs borne by the miner. Transaction fees is the fee offered by the users for the miner's services by providing them incentives to include their transaction in the block. Typically, the users are allowed to decide the transaction fees they wish to offer while creating a transaction. Although protocol designers can enforce a minimum transaction fees, but they cannot ensure that there are always enough unconfirmed transactions to include in a new block. So Bitcoin happens to be a purely deflationary currency. That is, the total amount of Bitcoins in the world remains fixed. This amount turns out to be 21 million Bitcoins, which more or less seems like an arbitrary constant. So this is achieved by halving the block reward roughly every 4 years. So since Bitcoin still needs to reward the miners for their mining, Satoshi assumed that once Bitcoin would be a mature currency, there would be enough transaction fees for the miners to collect. So there would be no need for block rewards. So after every 210,000 blocks, or roughly 4 years, the Bitcoin block reward is halved in an event called Bitcoin halving. So the last event of this kind took place on 11th May 2020, when the block reward was halved from 12.5 Bitcoins per block to 6.25 Bitcoins. So we observed an interesting observation at this time. So the network hash rate immediately after the halving began decreasing, which implied that some miners were exiting the system. This reduction in the network's hash rate indicates a reduced resilience to Byzantine adversaries. So anyone who wants to mount a 51% attack can do so with lesser computing power. So in this graph, you can see that there is a 25% drop in the mining power immediately after the Bitcoin halving on 11th May 2020. And notice that this network hash rate also stabilized immediately after the 14 days, which exactly coincided with the time period after which the Bitcoin's mining difficulty is readjusted. In fact, similar observations have also been reported by other researchers. And we also did not observe any remarkable change in Bitcoin's market price during the same time period, which means that the reward that the miners were obtaining was effectively halved. So a question that naturally arises is, why did the miners stop mining? So if you were to guess that miners could not generate enough revenue from these block rewards to justify their mining costs, you would exactly be right. If these miners had not quit, they would have been losing money. So let us formally analyze the same argument. First, we define the miner's utility that captures his revenue as well as his operating expenses. The miner's utility for mining a block could be defined as U of sigma, where sigma is the strategy that the miner adopts, is nothing but the probability that the block is accepted times the reward that is achieved when you mine a block, and subtracting the mining costs that the miner has to pay, which could result from electricity cost. uh, and this does not include the fixed infrastructure cost that the miner needs to invest at the beginning before mining. So if we were to put in real world data to calculate miners' actual utility in US dollars, you would also need to make certain assumptions about the miners. So let us assume that you are a Bitcoin miner in China who also happens to be operating this shiny new Ant miner box, which is one of the most efficient Bitcoin miners that money can buy. So you'll have the minimal cost of mining. So after all the calculation, it turns out that such a miner would be making roughly 28 cents an hour just before the halving. But as soon as the block reward is halved, he would start losing half a cent every hour. That is if he was still mining. If he was a rational miner, he would have preferred to quit mining, which could explain the sudden reduction in network's hash rate. In fact, these are very optimistic estimates, and if you were using slightly older equipment with lower efficiency, so you will have higher mining costs, then you could even be losing more money. So naturally, this has some serious implications for Bitcoin. So Bitcoin plans to transition to a transaction fee only model in the next century. So what does this mean for the future of Bitcoin? Until now, these Bitcoin halvings have been well compensated by an automatic reduction in the difficulty of miner, which involves retargeting every 2 weeks, and the rising market prices of Bitcoin. But what would happen when there are no block rewards and transaction fees is the miner's only source of income? So upon a formal analysis, we find that in a transaction fee model, honest mining is not guaranteed to be the best strategy for the miners. So to capture this notion that a protocol can provide an appropriate incentive to the participating miners to act honestly and also prevent them from leaving the system, we introduce the term faithful implementation. A blockchain protocol is practically safe against incentive-driven deviations by the miners if following the protocol is best response if all other miners are also following the protocol. This implementation in Nash equilibrium is termed as faithful implementation. So you can see the mathematical definition of the faithful implementation on the screen. So we also have a remark that the protocol is a faithful implementation if and only if the utility of mining of following the protocol is positive. So which follows since the miners can obviously leave the system, they can quit mining, and the utility of quitting would be zero. So any protocol that wants to be faithful implementation needs to have a non-zero utility. So theorem 2 of our paper on Bitcoin in transaction fee model formally states and proves that blockchain protocol cannot be faithful implementation in a transaction fee only model. It says that in a setting in which the miners derive a majority of their reward from transaction fees, Bitcoin will not be a faithful implementation. So the reason behind Bitcoin's failure is that a lower bound on the transaction fees cannot be guaranteed to the miners. And when we consider the worst case, in which there are not enough transaction fees available to recover the mining cost, they simply stop mining. So we simply consider that if the reward from the block, that is transaction fees, and the probability of mining is lesser than is not enough to cover the cost of mining, the utility becomes less than zero, which implies that the protocol is not a faithful implementation. So some of you might be thinking that thank God the miners only quit mining. They still have their computational power, and that computational power could be used for much more chaotic purposes. As it turns out, it can be even more profitable for the miners to start cannibalizing the blockchain. That is, they start grabbing the block rewards from the past in a strategy known as undercutting. So Carlston and his peers had shown that when there is a large variation in the transaction fees earned from the blocks, it might be profitable to intentionally fork the blocks that collected a high amount of transaction fees. Undercutting is a strategy in which an agent intentionally forks a block with a high reward in order to collect some of the rewards while offering the rest of the reward to other agents as an incentive to mine on top of this new block. So you're not only losing the miners, these miners are acting against you. So what about block rewards? So in the past, Bitcoin was operating only on block rewards. So what about that scenario? So theorem 1 of our paper on Bitcoin and block rewards formally states and proves that Bitcoin will be a faithful implementation in a setting with only block rewards. It says that in a setting in which miners derive their reward from block rewards, Bitcoin is a faithful implementation if you set the reward appropriately. That is, where your fixed block reward R is more than the coefficient of the mining cost alpha. So the proof for the same is quite straightforward. If we set up the block reward so that the miners are paid an amount more than sufficient to cover their mining costs, we can say that no matter where the miners mine a block, they would receive the same block reward. And as a miner, if you're paid the same amount, irrespective of where you place the block, we can easily show that mining on top of the longest chain is the dominant strategy. Hence, with block rewards, mining on top of the longest chain is the dominant strategy, implying that Bitcoin is a faithful implementation in block rewards. So you might be wondering whether these results are specific only to Bitcoin or they could be generalized to any blockchain protocol. And in fact, we find that we can generalize these results for any general blockchain protocol. So first we show that any blockchain protocol can be a faithful implementation if it sets up the block rewards appropriately. So theorem 3 of our paper states that any blockchain protocol where the miner derives majority revenue only from the block rewards, it is a faithful implementation. So again, the condition is that if the block rewards are set up appropriately to cover the mining costs of the miner. So if you set up your block reward R greater than alpha, which is the coefficient of mining cost, you are good enough. So before we can generalize these results, before we can start proving them, we must first define what is a general blockchain protocol. So we need to capture the state of a general blockchain protocol. And we do this by defining a triplet of B, the blockchain protocol, as a set of blocks B and a partial ordering over these blocks, a mapping of miners M, which maps the miners to these blocks. This notion allows us to capture DAG-based blockchains as well, which have become quite popular recently. So you not only necessarily have a linear blockchain, you could also have a block pointing to two or more blocks. So in order to ensure that a blockchain protocol is a faithful implementation, in this case, we need to show that the miner's best response is to mine the maximal block. So in order to prove that block rewards will make any blockchain protocol a faithful implementation, we make arguments on similar lines as we did for Bitcoin. So the same argument goes like this. If we set up the block reward so that miners are paid an amount more than sufficient to cover their mining costs, we can say that no matter where the miner mines their block, they would easily receive the same block reward. And as a miner, if you are paid the same amount, irrespective of where you place the block, we can easily show that mining on top of the longest chain or the maximal block is the dominant strategy. Hence, with block rewards, mining the maximal block is the dominant strategy. So, can we possibly create a blockchain protocol in faithful implementation in a transaction fee only model? So for several reasons, one might wish to create a purely deflationary currency such as Bitcoin, and then we'll need to use only transaction fees. So we show that it is not possible to create a faithful blockchain protocol in a transaction fee only model. So it's a negative result. Theorem 4 of our paper states that any blockchain protocol where the miner derives majority of its revenue only from transaction fees cannot be a faithful implementation. However, since the proof for this theorem is a bit involved, we request you to take a look at the paper. So, why are we concerned about a blockchain protocol being a faithful implementation or not? Or why is a faithful implementation good enough? So, faithful implementation is a weaker notion than many other forms of incentive compatibility, but with a few real world assumptions. So, we argue that it is a good enough notion. So, faithful implementation assumes that miners would not collectively deviate from the blockchain protocol. And the rationale behind this is that a collusion could lead to a loss of trust in the system, which could reduce the value of the cryptocurrency itself. In fact, we formally captured this argument in our hypothesis called the anti-collusion hypothesis, which says that Bitcoin miners would not collectively deviate from following the protocol if their collusion could hurt the perceived value of the cryptocurrency. So it is well known that the value of a blockchain-based cryptocurrency is derived from the fact that cryptocurrency is safe against malicious adversaries. And any blockchain that is vulnerable to a double spend attack by an adversary would not be able to provide any good amount of value, since no merchant would be willing to exchange goods for the cryptocurrency, fearing a double spend attack would render the cryptocurrency worthless. So if some miners collectively deviate from the blockchain protocol, it would simply lead to a reduction in the price of the protocol. So in essence, the participating miners are provided with incentives to act honestly and not collude. So the miners collectively try to maintain the security of the cryptocurrency to protect the perceived value of the currency. And so hence we say that utilities of all the strategies in which you require other miners to collude with you is negative. So it does not yield you any reward. So basically whatever reward you yield will be worthless because the currency value would be hurt. So you end up with negative utilities. So to recap, in this paper, we first introduced a notion of faithful implementation that captures the incentive compatibility of a blockchain protocol. Then we analyzed the Bitcoin protocol, first in a setting with transaction fees, and then in a setting with block rewards. And finally, we generalize our results to any blockchain protocol by showing that any blockchain protocol can be a faithful implementation in a setting with only block rewards, along with its complementary result that no blockchain protocol can be a faithful implementation in a setting with only transaction fees. So our take-home conclusion would be that while designing blockchain protocols, researchers should probably use block rewards for rewarding miners rather than transaction fees, as that would be beneficial for the miners and they would not quit in certain conditions. Thank you. Yeah, I'll take any questions if there are.
Thank you. See if the audience have questions. I have some question about the collusion model that you consider. We'll say that any collusion would impose a negative utility to the miner. Is that too strong an assumption? In the sense that some deviations from the truthful strategy are actually undetectable. They are deviating, but they are not really causing any damage in the system. Do you consider those as deviating, or those are still truthful?
So, I do not believe if there are any existing deviations that are not detectable. So, in fact, most of these deviations are detectable. So, if you were to start performing undercutting, the miners would notice that there are different versions of the block with different amount of rewards. And if you were to leave out some reward for other miners, that could easily be detected. So collusion in any form, or even perception of this collusion, like even if people had a circulating rumor that there may be collusion among the miners or the security of the cryptocurrency is damaged, it could hurt the perceived value of the currency. So like I'm talking about perceived value as the market price of Bitcoin. So if you were to think of price of Bitcoin in US dollars, that would be the perceived value of the currency. So that would definitely be removed. That could also be reduced based on speculations or rumors. So I believe that uh, this hypothesis should hold. Um, yeah.
I think even though this is not in the model, I get what you're hinting at. That it's not really the strategies themselves, it's how people perceive the system that
Yes.
would cause the problem.
Yes. In fact, we have had many cryptocurrencies that have like pump and dump schemes. They rise in value quickly and they also fall in value just based on rumors. So, yeah, I believe that perceived value is an important thing. Like miners jump onto the cryptocurrency and then again leave it. So, yeah.
Okay. A question from the audience, still about the anti-collusion assumption. It seems that with anti-collusion assumption, the only strategy the miners are which block to dig or to quit. Have you considered the actions where miners are still rational but collude to get higher rewards?
So, okay, so in our paper, we consider if the miners, so if a single miner was so mining a block anywhere in the blockchain, that could mean that he was also trying to fork. So he could also act adversarial in a way similar to an adversary. So we do consider that, and we show that the reward yielded in that strategy is not good enough unless and until you force other miners to change to that strategy. And if you have a certain fraction of miners that shift to that strategy, you could detect that. Then again, it's a point whether you have to steal the money, but you also do not have to be caught stealing the money. So if you steal a lot of money, you'll obviously get caught.
It's still about detectable, undetectable, or how people perceive about what's going on in the system.
Yes.
Okay. I know you didn't have time to talk about the impossibility result. Can you at least give us some high-level insights about what happens in there?
Okay. So in our impossibility result, what we show is that so first of all, we consider that you are not only getting the transaction fees from the block that you have mined. You can also average out the block reward in any form. So you can say that from the last 10 blocks, give the next miner the average of the reward from the last 10 blocks. So there are some protocols such as fruit chains that use these kinds of schemes to show that there is not a lot of variation in the transaction fees. So that they show that the some incentive driven deviations such as such as undercutting will not happen in their protocol. But we show that once once the transaction fees is low enough and the miners still keep on mining, someday or the other the total pool of transaction fees available that is available to give to the miners is, gets depleted, and so you run out of transaction fees to distribute among miners. So
Is
once you
that
run out of the reward,
because Bitcoin is limited supply and after the block rewards is gone, the money reward is gone, the currency will gradually accumulate at the miner's hands, and the amount of tokens being used for transaction fees will be smaller and smaller.
so we do not imply that the transaction fees will reduce. We say that if it gets reduced, then we are in trouble. So we do not make any claims on that whether you'll have enough transaction fees or not in the future. But if you do not have, then you are in trouble. And even the perception of not of being in trouble could lead to you actually getting in trouble. So it's what you say, tricky argument.
It is, yeah, I agree. Yeah, I think this work actually has a lot to do with how people perceive about the system. It would be interesting to see if this perception can be formally represented, formally captured in a model, and the reason about that, like about collusion and about transaction fees. It would be something like what people believe that would happen in the system, like believe about strategies. So.
Yes, in fact, we do mention in our paper that this anti-collusion hypothesis should definitely be investigated further. We do believe that there are a few things that we should investigate about this.
Yeah, I think there are other studies about regarding to selfish mining, even though we have demonstrated such thing could happen in the literature or in experiments or monitoring blockchains, people were not able to observe such things in reality. And there are studies about trying to explain why. Seems this one would fall into that category.
Yes, so in fact, despite all these incentive-driven deviations being discovered like 3 or 4 years ago, in fact, these are quite old now. There have been no observations. So one reason for not observing this undercutting attack is that there are a few measures built into the protocol that prevent a transaction from being cashed in at a later date. So there is a limit on the height of the block that you can cash in that transaction. So it becomes difficult to undercut, but it does not become impossible. So there are a few measures inside the protocol, and also that because of this anti-collusion hypothesis, or even the perception of this hypothesis, the miners are not deviating. In fact, it is typically seen that the Bitcoin miners have their own best interest in keeping the perception of the Bitcoin very safe. So we know in past history that there was this mining pool called ghash.io, which even though it managed to accumulate more than 51% computational power, it said that it will uh, cut down its computational power on its own, so that people do not perceive that one entity operates the entire system. So
Yeah, that's true. Okay, thanks. Very interesting.
thank you.
Organizer reminds us time is up. I think we will take 3 minutes break and then with all the speakers back for the Q&A session.